North America for the last how many decades?
All the best horror films, unspoken or spoken, reflect their time and culture. Night of the Living Dead came out in 1968, which is the most violent year of the 60s. It's the most, in some ways, it's a pivotal movie of the 60s because it shows the kids eating the parents, and it's literally a metaphor. Even Romero wasn't explicit, and he said that the content, political content, was very nil, except for having an African Americanist lead. They were very aware, obviously, of that social ramification, but in terms of the political climate of unrest, that's just something that came out of the material and the time and what they're doing. And, a film like The Plague, they'll look back on, they can say, this is at a period when kids were killing kids at school, and kids were being trained to use guns at an earlier and earlier age, and violence was being commodified and sold to kids as gameplay. People are uncomfortable with those issues about talking about kids and violence and why they do it or why they don't do it. And so, all films always have their cultural element. I think that's very important. But this problem is not going away, so The Plague is going to be relevant for as long as we have these problems.
What we saw in the entire history of horror films, from 1922 or so on, is that they always reflected some fear, some deep thing in the national or international psyche. After World War I, you had the Phantom of the Opera, who reflected the whole thing about being maimed and changed by the war and turned into a monster because of that. And then with the early years of the Depression, you had Dracula and Frankenstein becoming so popular because people felt that the world was out of control because people had taken science too far and economics too far and had become a monster that had turned on them. So, and the same thing was in the 1950s with the monsters from outer space, reflecting a fear of communism and so forth. So what I see in The Plague, and it could be entirely wrong, but one reason why to me it works so well was you see all these things happening to children since the 80s. What I responded to in The Plague was that these things happening to children who are being poisoned by the environment or by crazy medicine or by overstressed parents who are also being poisoned by the environment and by the stress of living in this technological era. So I did sense those, plus having seen a real plague, having seen AIDS, in which we see people that we love turning into some kind of hideous thing that we can't recognize anymore. There's that real recognition factor in your film that can't be denied.
Certainly, post 9/11, we're certainly living in a world where our excuse for violence is often, well, we're afraid that we may be attacked. We're afraid that someone may try and hurt us, so we're going to lash out. We're going to try to prevent it, and we're going to do it through violence. And I'm not saying necessarily that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a thing that exists, and we do have a social fear. So we wanted to write something that we found frightening in a way that people going to see the film hopefully would think about it for a long time afterwards, but would also feel it in their gut. Like I miss that about horror films, where I'd walk out of Rosemary's Baby and I'd be disturbed in some profound way that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Or The Exorcist, or any of those things, where it would linger like a nightmare. It would sit there in my gut and I'd feel it. I think the difference for me is films now, a lot of the films, not all of them certainly, but a lot of the horror films are more about sort of introducing characters and killing them off and sort of what frightening way can we kill them, as opposed to us actually having an investment in those characters and then finding true fear or true horror through those characters and by effect exploring our own fears.
The feeling of horror and desolation in the adults who were still alive and conscious was, I thought, one of the most important values in this script. Mm-hmm. What was more important to me than the kids engaging in violence and the violence perpetrated upon them was the fundamental awfulness of the situation and sadness, terminal sadness of the adults in the film, that they were the last generation. Actually, they describe the youngest members of our conscious cast as the last generation, and Kip and because there were no more kids after that. And I find it amazing because that theme has actually been replicated in a film that came out just recently called Children of Men. And it's uncanny how themes kind of arise, you know. And it also it goes back to the question of why you would want to do a film like this, and how important a genre can be. Because there's a whole lot of films out there now which really use the horror genre to look much more deeply into human beings' loneliness and psyche and situation than ever before.
You know, I was, for lack of a better word, a troubled youth. You know, I ended up in a school when I was 16 for what my friend Carrie likes to call a school for wayward boys, but was sort of like, for kids who were socially unacceptable or had been arrested a lot or been in a lot of trouble. And I had long hair and I was doing drugs, and I remember I'd walk into places, and people would be watching to see if I was going to shoplift, in a store, or, people would cross the street or whatever. And I always thought of myself as a pretty nice guy. I wasn't, violent. I wasn't, aggressive. But I looked a certain way, and apparently, that in and of itself, created an image that wasn't who I felt like I was inside. So I felt misunderstood just on initial appearance, and which of course I could have changed and chose not to. So there's a responsibility there. But so for me, these kids, we instantly call them monsters. But hopefully, the film by the end makes you question your own view of them, and how we act out of fear. Because I don't change the way the kids look by the end of the film. I hopefully change how we see them. Our viewpoint, our internal viewpoint. And all the shots we have of the kids, they just look like kids. All of a sudden, hopefully, you go, oh, these are just children. Where we really work to not have us sympathize with them in the beginning, to share the main character's fears that they were monsters.
At the end of our original Plague, that was so beautiful how that all came together, that the person that didn't match the vibration of the fear, that went into just loving them, that was the catalyst that allowed them to turn around and become whole and become a society that can start again. And that's the part of the heart script that I was sucked into, immediately. And as a mother, and it's interesting because I've played this theme many times in my career, Cujo being one of them, where monster, screwed up, disrespectful, whatever's going on with your kid really doesn't matter. You're the mother, and you will defend and take care of that child no matter what you have to do.
When Dee comes tearing in there to see her daughter, and Cal stops her and takes her in his arms, and that scene, that moment was so alive for me and so extraordinary. It practically wiped out the technical side of the head entirely for me. And in part, it was because I was working with you, and you brought so much into that. Look, I'm not blowing smoke.
Really
it was, it was true. There are moments where the emotion is so rich and so true that you are there.
Well, you have to be. If we're not, the audience is.
We'll never be.
Nora's desire